Good day. We are looking at chapter 19 of Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South. Chapter 19, of course, starts on page 176. The epigraph is angel visits, and this one, of course, refers to Margaret Hale, who visits Bessie. Now we know that Margaret had, in fact, the Hales had received the invitation from the Thorntons. It was quite a formal occasion, and the mother, Mrs. Hale, was the one who insisted that Margaret and her father attends, and then of course, there is the whole discussion in what Margaret is to wear. This is all at the beginning of chapter 19, page 176 and 177. And I just want to focus on the little verse there. As angels in some brighter dreams call to the soul when man doth sleep, so some strange thoughts transcend our wonted themes and into glory peep. And of course, the glory peeping is referring to heaven here. And the angel is Margaret in this white silk dress who goes to Bessie Higgins. And of course, Bessie Higgins is certain that she has seen this vision with Margaret in the white dress as an angel. So when our chapter starts, in the first 3 lines, Mrs. Hale is fascinated. It actually says in the 3rd line something of the simplicity of a child. She wants to know all the details, and she will not be going herself. And line 9, 10, and 11 says, Mrs. Hale had had her vanities as a girl and had perhaps unduly felt the mortification when she became a poor clergyman's wife. And that tells us that once she married Mr. Hale, she accepted this change that comes over her because of a financial situation that then becomes quite dismal. So when she marries the poor man, she accepts that her life will not have that dimension of the socializing, the parties, the frivolities, because there simply isn't money for that. And then on page 177 from line 12, I wish I knew what you ought to wear, because it's so socially important still for Mrs. Hale that they do the right thing, that they follow the correct etiquette here in Milnerton. And Margaret tries to, in fact, she does humor her mother by going to fit on different dresses, thereby entertaining her mother and distracting her mother. And then when we go to the last 6 lines on page 177, when she is with Bessie, and are you going to dine at the Thorntons at Marlborough Mills? Yes, Bessie, why are you so surprised? Oh, I don't know, but they visit with the first folk in Milton. And so the implication there is that the Hales are not quite on the same level with the Thorntons, despite the fact that they have class and breeding. They don't have the finances. And someone as poor, someone at the bottom of the food chain, and I'm talking now about Bessie, is aware of, one, the Hale status, and secondly, she is aware of the classism which is experienced in Milton. On page 178, in line 1, Bessie's cheeks flushed a little at her thought being thus easily read. She's embarrassed that she, who is the nobody, is able to put Margaret in an awkward situation. The coming to terms with the fact that Margaret is quite broke herself. In line 5 all the way down to 10 on page 178. No, said Margaret, that's very true. But look at this justification. But we are educated people and have lived amongst educated people. Is there anything so wonderful in our being asked out to dinner by a man who owns himself, who acknowledges inferior to my father by coming to him to be instructed? I don't mean to blame Mr. Thornton. Few Draper's assistants, as he was once, could have made themselves what he is. And so this makes it okay in Margaret's mind. The fact that they have limited education, whereas the Hales, they have the class, they have, in inverted commas, the breeding, and they have the education. Then when we go to the last 13 lines, and from the bottom of the page up, but them ladies dress so grand, said Bessie, with an anxious look at Margaret's print gown, which her molten eyes appraised at 7 pence a yard. And so it's a bit of humor injected here by Elizabeth Gaskell, that Bessie looks at what Margaret is wearing, and even she can recognize that it's a cheap little dress. And then at the end of page 178, Bessie is so relieved to discover that Margaret actually does have something quite appropriate to wear. And then on line 5 on page 179, Bessie says, I wish I could see you dressed up. I reckon you're not what folk could call pretty. You've not red and white enough for that, but don't you know, I have dreamed of you long before I've ever seen you. So she says, you're not pretty. When she says red and white, you're not very pale with the rosy cheeks. Remember that Margaret has been living in the country, so she's probably got a healthy tan by Caucasian standards. And but she says when you're dressed up, the implication is there that you'll probably look quite respectable. And then she says, I've dreamed about you, and this vision that she has, which is then discussed on the rest of page 179, is of course of Margaret portrayed as an angel. And for us, especially in the last paragraph on page 179, we see the blurring of reality with the dream world for Bessie. And I think it's safe to say that this just gives us insight that her illness is quite severe. Maybe she's quite feverish, maybe she is hallucinating a little bit, and she gets things quite muddled up. Then when we get to page 180, Margaret asks her the very important question. Let's talk about it sometimes if you think it's true. But now tell me, has your father turned out? Turned out? Has he gone on strike? Yes, said Bessie heavily, in a manner very different from that she had spoken in but a minute of that before. And so talking about Margaret, about the dress was really distracting Bessie. And now she's brought back to the reality of her world, back to the reality of the strike. And line 6 to 11 is very, very disturbing. All hampers men, and many a one besides. The women are as bad as the men in their savageness. There's this time food is high, and they must have food for their children, I reckon. Suppose Thornton send them their dinner out. The same money spent on potatoes and meal would keep many a crying baby quiet and hush up its mother's heart for a bit. So Margaret feels a bit guilty about going to a lavish dinner, and secondly, a lavish dinner at the home of the employer when his own workers are starving to the point where babies are crying because they are that hungry. And we'll see more of that. And I think it's safe to say that Elizabeth Gaskell really wanted to tug at the emotional heartstrings of her readers. Nobody wants to think of children, no matter where they are from or who they are, suffering because of hunger. And then the middle of page 180, when we have Bessie and she is speaking as if she's dead already, but it's actually because of the fever. And then the latter part, the last 5 lines, where Bessie has nightmares about the effects of the strike, and she in the last line talks about women complaining, women crying, the price of meat, and how the children cannot sleep at night because they are that hungry. It's something very difficult to relate to, but something that is going to affect us anyway. And so it's safe to say, why do I keep saying that? That Gaskell wants the reader to be filled with compassion and maybe even moved to doing something. I'm not quite sure what. And in line 4, Margaret asks, and do they think the strike will mend this? Will it somehow solve the problem of the hunger? They say so, replied Bessie. They do say trade has been good for long and the masters have made no end of money. How much farther doesn't know, but of course the union does, as is natural. They want their share of the profits, you know. And so even the union want their share as well. And then when Higgins comes in, he is, and I'm talking now from line 17 till 22, Mr. Higgins is very confident that they are going to win this strike. And I think it's understandable that he is so confident, because you need to hold on to your belief that you will win the strike. And then the last 4 lines, when he hears about Margaret's plans for the evening. Thornton's, are you going to dine at Thornton's? Ask him to give you a bumper to the success of his orders by the 21st, I reckon. He'll be potted in his brains how to get them done in. Tell him there's 700 that will come marching into Marlborough Mills the morning after he gives 5% and will help him. In other words, all the way till the end of that whole big chunk on page 182, Mr. Higgins wants to use Margaret as a conduit to pass on the information. What information? Give into our demands and all your workers will return, and they will be even more productive than usual. And of course, Margaret is quite uncomfortable with this and she leaves. What is interesting, when she's back at home now, and I'm looking at lines 14 to 17, the medicines and treatment which Dr. Donaldson had ordered for Mrs. Hale did her so much good at first that not only she herself but Margaret began to hope that he might have been mistaken and that she could recover permanently. And so she takes a really good turn. She's a really positive turn. But line 11 from the bottom, there was a gloomy brooding of discontent. Okay, and so Mr. Hale has been exposed to stories about how the men are suffering, the laborers, and he is quite distressed about it. Okay. Then on page 100, you just have to read this. You just have to read this. I'm just focusing on what is, I think, relevant, what is pertinent, and then you will connect the dots. Line 5 from the bottom of page 183. Mrs. Hale his presence after the way he had spoken, his bringing before her the doom which she was vainly trying to persuade herself might yet be averted from her mother, all conspired to set Margaret's teeth on edge as she looked at him and listened to him. And so Margaret is very unhappy with the doctor and the doctor's findings. Okay, and then on page 184 we have just that whole thing there about Mr. Higgins of the poor family, but Mr. Boucher is the one who really gets through to the reader. Mr. Boucher is at the bottom of the bottom rung, and his family and other families like him are having it really bad. And on page 185 in line 5, when John Boucher comes in and he just gives vent to everything. It's no use, Higgins, when he says you cannot live long in this. Now it's all in dialect, clear evidence of the lack of education. You just sinking away, not for want of meat herself, but because you cannot stand the sight of the little one starving, yes, crying. 5 shillings a week may do well enough for thee, but with 2 mouths to fill, and one on a wench who can well earn her own meat, but it's claiming to us, and I'll tell thee plain. Oh, and he carries on, and then, oh gosh, it's terrible, it's terrible. And this works, this evokes sympathy in the reader, because despite all their flaws, these are family men. And like I've said before, the children are starving. And if you don't have empathy as a Victorian reader, then there is something drastically wrong with you. And I again want to focus, on the theme of compassion. Okay, and then it's going to be so bad for Margaret to go to this grand evening affair. On the bottom of page 186, yes, said Margaret, the last 4 lines. Let me bring you what money I can spare. Let me bring you a little food for that poor man's children. Don't let them know it comes from anyone but your father. It will be but a little. And I like this part because Margaret is taking positive action. And I think that this is meant to be a guide for the Victorian readers, that in your way you can contribute, you can do something small. On page 187 from line 17, which is about in the middle, Margaret sat utterly silent. How was she ever to go away into comfort and forget that man's voice, Mr. Boucher now, with a tone of unutterable agony, telling more by far than his words of what he had to suffer? She took out a purse. She had not much in it, of what she could call her own, but what she had, she put in Bessie's hands without speaking. And so we see that Margaret is deeply affected. And I think this is important because it's going to help us to understand her further engagement with Mr. Thornton. Margaret has seen, she has heard firsthand what laborers are experiencing and how they are suffering. And then when we get to the end of chapter 19, on the last page, page 188, Bessie seemed much quieter today, but fearfully languid, just lying there apathetically and exhausted. As she finished speaking, she looked so faint and weary that Margaret became alarmed. "It's it's nothing," said Bessie. "It's not death yet. I had a fearful night with dreams, or something like dreams, for I were wide awake and I'm all in a swounding daze today." She's in quite a daze, right, mate? She's probably hallucinating. "Only yon poor chap made me alive again. No, it's not death yet. Death is not far off. Yes, cover me up and I may sleep, if the cough will let me." Shame, and that cough which developed working in the factory is ever present and ever remind her of her mortality. Good night, good afternoon, may happen, I should say, but the light is dim and mystery today. And that's a really awful chapter, and I think it's important that you really go through it quite meticulously so that you know the details of the suffering experienced by not just John Boucher and his children. So if I can just quickly end off by saying that if the union gives you, let's say for argument, 50 pence for the week, let's just say, for right, and if you have only got yourself, your wife and one child to feed, maybe you can squeeze out on that money. But in another home where they've got 5 children to feed and 2 adults on the same money, there just isn't going to be enough food to feed the family. And so things do become rather tight and they do starve. They starve. And starving is, of course, something that we can't relate to it. We've never had to starve. If we miss a meal, we know we're going to make it up the next meal. Or if we miss a meal, it's often by mistake. It's by our own choice. And like I say, we will make up. But this is watching your family starve, weaken, possibly die, simply for the promise or the hope that in the future you can offer them more and you can offer them a better life. And very heavy reading, very emotional and very informative at the same time. And so that ends our chapter 19 of our novel North and South.